From Unity Church of Christianity in Houston, Texas, this is The Awakened Life with Reverend Howard Caesar. Unity is a non-denominational Christian church providing a positive, practical, and progressive approach to Christianity. Let's join the service in progress with the Reverend Howard Caesar.
You know, today I want to talk a little bit about the fact that we all have a higher self. We all have a higher self, and that higher self, that when you're in it and connected to it and aligned with it, it's about love and it's about oneness. And in order to find that higher self and to attune to it, you have to move inward, look inward. All right? Now, just for understanding purposes, we all have a lower self, okay? And sometimes we're in the lower energies. And the lower energies and the lower self is often referred to as the ego, ego, edging God out. And the nature of the lower self or ego is always to bring on fear and the idea of separation. So higher self is love and oneness, lower self is fear and separation. So a question that I have for you today is, how much are you of it? How much are you of it? Does that make sense? So what are you of? What I'm saying is, how much are you of the world? Remember that statement that is often used, be in the world but not of it? So how much are you of it? How much are you in the world and being of it? You know, most people who are in the world are a great deal of it. They're of its ways, of its tendencies of, you know, carrying us into fears and judgments and biases and prejudices and divisions and separation. That's the way of the world. And we get bombarded by all of those perspectives and approaches. And the focus of that is kind of outward, you know, and it's more often than is the inward. And so we naturally are drawn to some extent, this outer material world and all its aspects, because we have a material body. We live in a three-dimensional physical world, and it should be no surprise that we would naturally often have acquired a kind of materialistic consciousness that is looking outward and of the world. We think the world is real. We think the world is permanent. We think it's our permanent home, but it's temporal, you know. The truth is, the world is merely a transient, temporal place for our souls to enter into for a time, to gain a greater understanding, to be able to grow spiritually, evolve spiritually, and learn to love. It is a time for us to awaken to the truth. And this is the school that we're in. The classroom is every day. That's what it's about. And it's important for us to really be focused on and understand that. We tend to have our focus drawn outward to an external world, to be in and of the world. You know, we tend to think of ourselves as a physical being. And we have a physical body, don't we? And so we think in terms of three dimension oftentimes, rather than to fully focus on and identify ourselves with our spiritual identity, the fact that we are a spiritual being, that there's something that's inside of this physical form, that this is the clothing of a soul, the clothing of a spirit, this clothing of an eternal dimension in us. And we're housed in a physical body, yes. And this whole idea of the higher self and its focus is where Jesus talked about it. He said, Enter ye in by the narrow gate, for wide is the gate, and broad is the way that leads to destruction, to frustration, to conflict, to upset, all of that, lack of peace, disease. And many are they that enter thereby, okay? And then he said, for narrow is the gate, and straight the way that leads to life, you know, and few are they that find it. And so the broad way leads to destruction, confusion, conflict, upset, things not working out. The narrow way leads to life, joy, peace, harmony, love, all of those characteristics that are your true nature, that are indicative and part of your true higher self. That's who you really are. And so this idea of destruction is not talking about really a destruction of an afterlife, going to hell or something like crazy like that. The destruction is not about any kind of punishment delivered by God either. The destruction is simply what is the result of choices by being a part of the world, so to speak, of all of those sense of separation and division and polarities and opinions and beliefs and judgments and internal conflicts, all that dimension that is down here in the ego, that's about fear in the lower levels, as opposed to higher levels, which is of your higher self. And so the narrow gate is Jesus' reference to being in the world, but not of it. Okay? Even the Apostle Paul, he said, "Be not conformed to this world, but be ye transformed by the renewing of your mind." In other words, get out of the lower self conditioning of the mind and allow your mind to be renewed, all right, into a higher way. Eric Butterworth, one of the great authors, Unity authors, actually has passed on now, but his works still remain. And in some of his writings somewhere, he said something like, he said, "The only hope for mankind lies in the great undiscovered depths within." Okay, so he's talking about the narrow gate. And the narrow is moving inward, because the tendency is to go broad and wide, which is outward in all the pulls and the tugs of life and the material world. And so we're saying that the broad way is always the external world. The broad way is the idea of separation, polarity, division, conflict, fear, all these things. And the narrow way is the great within. It's heaven's home that is inside every person. And it's finding and living from that higher, more powerful part of you. And it's understanding that you have a higher, more powerful part of you, always. It's always there. We don't access it. Have you met your higher, more powerful part yet? Have you met your higher self yet? Ask yourself, have I met my higher self yet? Have I dabbled there? Have I really found out who I am? Have I touched that part of myself? How much have I lived from that part of myself? Do I really believe I have that part of myself? You know, we've all heard accounts of near-death experiences. And here's another one. Okay? And they have some similarities, but I wanted to share this one because it has some content in it that feeds into the idea we're talking about today. It gives some insight there. And realize that, a near-death experience always produces some glimpse into the world beyond. And it gives us some truth, or an individual who's had that near-death experience, some kind of truth that associates them in life in a new way, some insight that totally changes them. They don't look at life ever again the same way. It takes them in a huge leap forward and causes a shift. So anyway, this near-death experience, the person lost control of his car while driving by a construction area on the freeway. And he tells his story, and it goes like this. He says, "Immediately after hitting the steel girders, I felt myself floating out of my body and hovering above it. I was aware of all the people watching me as I lay there paralyzed by the shock of what had just occurred. I remember looking down at my body and seeing it for the first time in a three-dimensional way. At first it was strange, but I knew I was still connected to it in some way. At first, I have read somewhere that many times people don't relate to their bodies when they go through a near-death experience, but I did. He said, I remember that there was no pain whatsoever. I felt free, happy, whole, and I knew that this was the real me." It's important you get that. In that experience, he got that. That was the real him. Free, happy, whole. He says, as I looked down at my bloody and lifeless body, an enormous wave of compassion instantly washed over me, and I wanted to let everyone know I would be fine. I think everybody thought I was dead. They needed to know that this was only a temporary condition, but they could not hear my thoughts. And then suddenly I felt myself being pulled at an enormous speed. I felt as if I was rising higher and higher, and I immediately became aware of a brilliant light, very common to these experiences, aware of a brilliant light, and then this light seemed all-knowing, yet it reminded me that I also had all this knowledge. Instinctively, I knew that everything I ever needed to know was already inside of me. Very important. I remember being aware that I was one with all people on the planet, simultaneously at that one moment. I realized that we were all connected. How can I explain it? I was aware of people in different countries involved in many types of activity at the same time. And overall, I knew that everyone was me, but in a different body. I was filled with a sense of depression from people in hospitals and prisons. I could see people praying in churches, mosques, temples, and I felt their intentions for the world and each other, even though they were not aware of each other's common thoughts and prayers. And as my awareness peaked, I was very conscious of the beautiful planet Earth called home. It was so extraordinary. I was aware of it breathing and pulsating, much like a human body. It wasn't a big ball of lifeless matter, but very much alive. It shone like a shimmering blue and green jewel floating in the universe. And as I looked closer, I could see some of the horrible destruction done to Mother Earth. It was like seeing inside a person's body that had tumors and blocked arteries. I could see a blackness of impending death. The Earth was gasping for breath from the weight of pollution piercing into her body. I knew then that she was dying and needed help from me. I had to do something, even though at the time I felt helpless. And at that instant, I remember thinking, I can't go yet. My work isn't done. I have to go back and save Earth. I must tell others that this planet lives and that we have a responsibility to keep her alive. But how could I go back and fix her when probably every bone in my body was broken? A being of light quickly filled me with the impression that I was part of a divine plan, as is every person, and that my ultimate purpose is to love and to serve all sentient beings. And I could tell that the light being understood all my fears and doubts. And I was assured that I would heal and be able to do the work necessary to feed my soul and to help Mother Earth. And the moment I had that thought, I was immediately back in my body. And I awakened to find myself lying on a gurney in an ambulance. And I could hear the sound of the siren as two paramedics knelt over me, both faces filled with apprehension and concern. And I smiled and heard one of them say, "We got him back." Yes, you could say I came back that day. I came back in a new light and with a new perspective. I have since been involved in many green projects and have created organizations all over the world to help save this planet. So he found his divine plan in that experience. Okay, and that's what he's saying, among other things. But he concludes by saying, since my experience, I have never looked at life, death, and people the same. I honor everyone I come in contact with, especially myself. And he's honoring himself because he saw a part of himself, his higher self. He met himself, if you will. And it's important that he was saying the real me is the part of me that it was free and happy and whole at all times. You know, that's your higher self. And it was saying that there was this light, and this light was all-knowing, but it reminded me I also had all-knowing and all-knowledge. That's the higher self. He said all that I ever needed to know was already inside of me. That's your higher self. You're one with all, that sense of connectedness, no separation. That's your higher self. The dimension of compassion that reached out for people that he felt in that experience. That's your higher self. That's who you are, you see. And so it is this all-knowing part of us that is connected to a higher state of the truth of who we are. And this light that is within, this great withinness of you, if you will, has caused poets and philosophers and masters and mystics and teachers down through the centuries to write and talk and speak about this part of us. Okay, so it's not just dreamed up. These who have gone deep and know it, they've met it and want to talk to us about it. That's what Jesus was really introducing us to, was that dimension of ourselves. He called it the kingdom of heaven. That's what it is when you're in it, that higher energy and vibration. But Robert Browning, in a poem called Paracelsus, says it very well too and was inspired. and had caught a glimpse of it. And this is the way he spoke of it. He said, "Truth is within ourselves. It takes no rise from outward things, whatever you may believe. There is an inmost center in us all, where truth abides in fullness, and around wall upon wall the gross flesh hems it in. This perfect, clear perception, which is truth. A baffling and perverting carnal knowledge binds it and makes all error. But to know, rather consists in opening out a way when the imprisoned splendor may escape, rather than effecting entry for a light to come from without." So really talking about the truth, this that abides within this inmost center, and that the opening is to create this releasing of an imprisoned splendor, which is your higher self. So it's a beautiful way of talking about it, the undiscovered depths within. Hidden away in every person, there is a gold mine, really. And the problem seems that, really, it seems to be either we don't believe we have this dimension of us, or we don't know how to access it, or we don't make it important enough to really go the narrow road, the straight, the narrow, and have that laser focus of knowing that there's a dimension of us that we can bring to every situation, rather than letting the lower vibrations of an ego that edges God out dictate to us as we travel the pathway of life. So have you met your higher self yet? The higher, more powerful part of you that you carry with you at all times. And there are different names for this higher self, of course, and we have gone over this in the past, and this is one of the things that maybe is a distinction for unity in terms of talking about the difference between Jesus and Christ. And really distinguishing that. We've said that one of the teachings that aligns us really with all the masters and mystics and teachers down through time, since the time that Jesus appeared on the planet, have all spoken of the idea that Jesus was the person. Jesus was the person, but Christ is not a person. That Christ is a degree of stature that Jesus attained. And it is a potential stature that exists in every person. And that's the way it is spoken of. Paul, the apostle, said, "Christ in you, and you in you, your hope of glory." Okay? Find that Christ in you, that degree of stature, that higher self, that vibration that lives in you. Okay? Christ existed before Jesus came to earth, you have to understand. Christ is the name of the divine idea that you and I are held to be in the mind of God. It is the name for our divinity. It's the level of stature, okay? It is waiting to be called into expression. And it is what Jesus was referring to when Jesus himself exclaimed, and you can find this in the Gospel of John, where Jesus says, quote, "And now, Father, glorify thou me with thine own self, with the glory which I had with thee before the world was." So there was a self called a higher self, called after Jesus the Christ self, that is a dimension of you and me, that is the perfect idea that we're held to be in the mind of God, where freedom and wholeness and joy exist, just as this person who had a near-death experience said, that was the real me that I met. Okay? It's the anointed one, if you will, the anointed of God that is in everyone. Jesus modeled it. He displayed it. He expressed it in fullness. And that's why he said, "Follow me into that kingdom." Okay? Claim it. Emily Cady, a great writer, one of the great metaphysical writers, she wrote so beautifully, and she said, "We all must recognize that it was the Christ within which made Jesus what he was. And our power now to help ourselves and to help others lies in our comprehending the truth. For it is the truth, whether we realize it or not, that this same Christ lives within us that lived in Jesus. It is the part of himself which God has put within us, which ever lives there, with an inexpressible love and desire to spring to the circumference of our being, or to our consciousness, as the sufficiency of all things." You understand that this is the sufficiency of all things. No matter what it is you encounter, no matter what it is you face, no matter what you come up against, it is sufficient unto that. in the three-dimensional world. You have to go the narrow gate and go that narrow path with laser focus and know who you are and bring that to whatever you face in the outer world, and it will be the all-sufficiency in all things. The whole makeup of it is love. And when a person discovers this higher self in themselves, they begin to see it in everyone, and they see that they are everyone, is the way mystics speak of it. There is no separation. And we're all part of the one body of God, so to speak. There is a wonderful story that James von Prague shared that touched me, moved me, in one of his books. And James von Prague, if you don't know, he's been here to speak. He is a medium, a very good medium. He's helped a lot of people around the world release a lot of pain having to do with loved ones who have crossed over. But anyway, around 15 years ago, he tells about a time where he took a group of 30 people to visit spiritual centers in Brazil. And by this time, he says he had been on his own spiritual quest for a long time, and he had connected with his higher self through meditation and deep processes. And as he states, when connected to our higher selves, we see life from a loving viewpoint. And regardless of flaws, we don't see the flaws, we don't see beyond imperfections. And we know that our life's purpose is to contribute our talents, our gifts, and to make this world a better place, that we really have a mission and a purpose in being here. You get that living from your higher self. And so there was one particular center in Brazil that they visited that offered something similar to a shamanic journey. And it was an experience that was quite deep and lasted 6 hours. And it was amazingly transformative for him. And participants interacted with the spirit world during these ceremonies that he was involved in at this one center. And to help attune themselves to the higher frequencies of the spiritual dimensions, they were offered to drink a tea, a Hiawatha tea, which comes from leaves of a vine that is taken from the Amazon rainforest. And they have been used for centuries in this part of the world. And it's a kind of it has hallucinogenic properties that heighten one's awareness and helps a person communicate with the higher part of their being. And so the priest or the host that was there said that it has a unique experience to whoever takes it, but it will always add healing in some way or another to that person. So James drank the tea, and he noticed that his sense of perception began to alter, and he began to close his eyes and began to experience visions, very vivid visions. And he said then he felt like he was transported to another place. And wherever he went, so to speak, he said there was a person that appeared in front of him in this vision, and it was in a robe of purple and gold. And James says, I had a strong sense that I knew him and had always known him. He handed James a gold ring with a 6-pointed amethyst in it. And he was told that it was the world beyond's way of acknowledging that he was an initiate, like it was an honor. And he didn't know how to interpret this, and he asked, who are you, of this being in front of him? And he said the instant that he asked the question, he knew the answer. He said, I was staring at myself. Not the human James, but my higher self. My higher self, the soul of me, James. He said it was probably the most profound experience of his life. A week later, in a northeastern part of Brazil, still on the same trip, he went into a jewelry store, asked the shopkeeper if they carried any amethyst rings. She went to a drawer, opened it up, and pulled out the same exact ring with the 6-pointed amethyst gold ring that he had seen in the vision. He took it, put it on, it fit perfectly. He bought it. It was like a mystical experience. Why do I share all this with you? Because really I'm trying to emphasize nothing can be more important in this life than to discover our spiritual essence, to connect with that higher self, to live from it, to begin to grow into it. We should be asking ourselves, am I on purpose with my higher self? Am I attuned to it? Am I seeking to listen to it, build a relationship with it, identify with it? Surely we don't want to be disappointed after this life on earth is over and wish that we had spent more time focusing on our inner selves rather than all the attention and the busyness that's pulled us outside of ourselves. Okay, we don't want to have wished that we had slowed down some and focused a bit more on being a more loving person, a more forgiving person, a more understanding person, to understand how our lives affect and interact with others, how our lives actually impact the world itself in total. We are a part of it. Abraham Lincoln is quoted to say, "And in the end, it is not the years in your life that count, it's the life in your years." So, how is it that we really live from the higher self? We are living from and engaging our higher self when we are changing our perspective about life, always taking it to new and higher views of it. When we see problems as stepping stones and we learn from them and we look for the positive no matter how negative a situation may be, we are in our higher self. Our higher self is about really connecting with our mind and understanding the power of the mind. The Course in Miracles says, think honestly what you have thought that God would not have thought, and what you have not thought that God would have you think. That dynamic is going on, and that question is a question of your higher self. The higher self is about ceasing from all blaming anyone and anything in the world, taking responsibility for what's happening, transcending what is taking place. The higher self will free you from the past. It always moves beyond victimhood. It always moves beyond fear and into faith. The higher self is always listening to the voice of intuition. It knows enough to meditate and get quiet and touch that dimension of one's being. It always will not let others, let others' opinions define you. The higher self focuses on what you want, not what you don't want. The higher self is always moving beyond self-centeredness. It does not judge others. It tries to see with compassion another individual, to walk in their moccasins. It lives the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. It doesn't take life terribly seriously in the sense that problems come and go, money comes and go, but you are eternal and you stand in that knowing, and that whatever role that you find yourself in this life, you learn to do the most with what you have been given. This, and most importantly, the measure of your life is measured by how much love has passed through your consciousness as a soul, for yourself and for others. The only failure of any consequence that we can have in this life is only in the missed opportunities to express love, compassion, forgiveness, because that's what we came to push past. Those are the lessons, and your higher self will take you there. The question is, have you met your higher self? Please know that there is this higher, more powerful part that connects you to your divine plan and your purpose, and may you know that and then be about the spiritual progress and advancement that you came here to do, and then you truly will be a light in this world. God bless you all.
Thank you for joining us for today's message. We invite you to be with us again next Sunday. At Unity, we believe that God's presence of love and goodness is everywhere, and that life is meant to be good. You can find out more about Unity and our teachings at unityhouston.org.